Chapter 11. A Primitive World. It would be impossible to describe the amazement and rage we felt on finding that we had returned to the shore we had left. So, my uncle said grimly, fate wishes to play tricks with me. Well, I will not retreat. Listen, uncle, I said, we cannot struggle against that dangerous sea again. To the raft, he cried, as if I hadn't spoken. Hans began repairing the raft and loading our supplies on board. There is no hurry, my boy, said the uncle. We shall not start until tomorrow. For now, let us explore these shores, for they are somewhat distant from our starting point. We walked along the sandy shore for a mile. Then the sand turned to a dusty material. I was looking at the dust when I felt my uncle halt beside me. What's the matter? I asked, looking up. But he didn't have to answer. Before my eyes rested the fossil remains of every animal known to man, and some that were undoubtedly not yet known. It was more than a scientist could stand. Suddenly, my uncle's excitement rose, and he darted over the dust to pick up a skull. Harry, he cried, this is a human head! I was as amazed and as overjoyed as he. A human skull from this period in history when no human was thought to exist, and a skull covered with a parchment-like skin, with the teeth intact, and a full head of hair. What wondrous soil was this to have preserved the head for millions of years? And the body, 6 feet in length, was there too, surrounded by this man's hatchets and flints. We were in the cemetery in an extinct world. My uncle quickly gathered up many of these specimens to convince the world above. Had these beings been buried by a tremendous earthquake, or had they lived here in this underground world? And were any of these men still wandering around these shores inside the earth now? We turned inland towards a vast forest in the distance. We decided to see what new discoveries the forest held for us. We had just entered the forest and were examining the giant ferns, pines, and yews when some movement caught my eye. I stopped in my tracks. There, in the distance, was a herd of mastodons, gigantic elephants of the prehistoric period. They were uprooting trees with their giant trunks and eating them as if they were leaves from a small tree. We watched in astonishment. Let us get closer, my uncle said. No, I answered. We have no weapons. Come away, I beg you. No man could face these monsters. No man? My uncle whispered. Then how do you account for him? I looked to where my uncle was pointing. There indeed was a human being, a gigantic human being, who seemed to be herding the even more gigantic mastodons. He was at least 12 feet tall, with a head as big as a buffalo's. A mane of matted hair covered his gigantic head. Come, come, I cried, dragging my uncle along. We must get away before he sees us. For once, my uncle did not resist my suggestion, and 15 minutes later we were far away from that terrible monster. When we felt that we were safe from the giant and his monstrous herd, we slowed our pace and headed once more for the central sea. We were walking along the sandy shore when suddenly a bright object caught my eye. I ran to pick it up. What is it? My uncle asked. This, I said, and I handed him a rusty dagger. It is only a common knife used by many Icelanders, he said. It must be Hans's. No, I said. This knife is not a day old, nor a year old, nor a century old, but much more. Yet it is made of steel. Look at this mold and rust on it. I recognize it as a Spanish dagger from the 16th century. Then some man must have preceded us on this beach, he said, and the jagged edges on the dagger look as if they were made by someone trying to carve a message on some rock. Perhaps by a man who was trying to indicate the road to the center of the earth. We looked at the rocks surrounding the sandy beach and found a narrow path leading from the sea to a cave. We followed it carefully, our feet in the water, to a huge overhanging rock. Beneath it lay the entrance to a dark cave. Inside the cave, we found a square slab of granite. On it were carved letters which had been worn by age, the initials of the traveler who had made this journey before us. "A.S.!" cried my uncle. "You see, I was right. Arn Saknussemm came this way." Ever since we started our amazing journey, I experienced one surprise after another. But, after finding the initials of Saknussemm here, carved in the bowels of earth 300 years ago, I had to admit that now nothing of this journey would be impossible. "Let us go forward!" I cried eagerly. But my uncle stopped me. "Let us go back and get Hans," he said. "We will sail the raft to this point on the coast." That evening, we had returned to the cave and explored inside. We had gone no more than a dozen steps when we were stopped by a huge block of solid granite. There was no turn to take. "There is no opening here," my uncle said sadly. "But what about Saknussemm?" I asked. "Perhaps this rock closed off the passage during the 300 years since he made his journey," he said. "We must find a way to remove it," I cried wildly. "Perhaps we can attack it with pickaxes and crowbars," my uncle suggested. "That will never do," I said. "We could never pry it away with ordinary tools. No, we must use gunpowder and blow it out of our way." "Marvelous!" my uncle cried. "To work!" By midnight, we had dug a hole in the rock large enough to hold 50 pounds of gunpowder. They had 50 pounds of gunpowder the whole time? We then stretched a long wick to carry the flame to it from outside the cave. Resisting the temptation to light it immediately, we instead slept until morning. The next day, the 27th of August, we were all up at 6 o'clock and ready. I took the lantern and went to the fuse, which would take about 10 minutes to burn. My uncle and Hans remained in safety on the raft. We planned to sail a distance away to avoid any effects of the explosion. "Are you ready?" my uncle asked. "Quite ready," I answered. "Then fire away!" My heart was jumping. I lit the wick, then ran back to shore and jumped on the raft. Hans guided us a distance away while the fire was headed for the charge. 5 minutes," said my uncle. 4, 3, 2, 1 minute to go. 30 seconds. Then the roar of an explosion. The sea seemed to have gone mad. It became one huge mountain on top which tumbled the raft. Then I felt as if we were going down a tremendous well. We clung together in silence. Beneath the rock which had been blown up, there was a great hole, and the water of the central sea poured into it like a mighty torrent, forming an inland sea and dragging us along with it. For 2 hours, the raft moved down this sea, achieving speeds of over 100 miles per hour. We held on to each other lest we fell off the raft and be killed. There was no doubt that we were upon the road taken by Saknussemm, but instead of climbing down as we had planned, we were taking the whole sea with us. After several hours, the tunnel widened, but the raft kept spinning and rushing at lightning speed, more than 100 miles an hour. I managed to recover my balance enough to check our supplies. Most had disappeared. Of all our instruments, only the chronometer and the compass were on the raft. And to make things even worse, no food, not even 1 day's supply, remained. Suddenly I felt a shock, yet we did not hit anything hard. Water poured all over us. We were caught under a giant waterfall, which almost drowned us. But in a few seconds, the raft was forced out from under it, and we were once more along our way. "Harry! Harry!" I heard my uncle call. "Do you see what has happened? We are now being carried upward." I touched the wall, which ripped at my hand. We were indeed going upward, and at an extraordinary speed. "The water of this central sea must have hit the bottom," my uncle reasoned, "and is now forcing us up this narrow well." A whole hour passed. The fate that awaited us waited us seemed to be a rock roof at the top of the well and a crushing death.